main categories. So one is pass-through securities. So these are the securities which pay out periodic interest and principal payments from the underlying loan pool, and it's distributed to the investors who are holding these pass-through certificates. Now, the thing is the prepayment risk, which we have been discussing for some time now. That is faced equally by investors. That is, there is no separate profiling of prepayment risk which happens. That is, there is no tranching. We'll talk a bit about tranching when we talk of CMOs. But for pass-through securities, we don't really have a separate tranching structure. That is, we don't have a separate slice in order to manage the prepayment risk. So prepayment risk will be faced equally by investors. The second category is CMOs, or collateralized mortgage obligations. These are like a step ahead from pass-through securities. So they are comparatively more complex because here we study tranching. So when we say tranching of securities, we have individual slices of securities which we are looking at, and every tranche is has a different rating classification, and consequently it has separate kind of risk and return profile. That is the prepayment risk which we have been which we spoke about. That is something which can be distributed across tranches. Now, investors can choose depending on their level of risk tolerance, that is, how much amount of prepayment risk they're willing to take. So, based on that, they can take a position in a certain tranche, and that's how their prepayment risk can be managed. Now, the underlying for CMOs, these can be mortgage pools. Also, it can be separate mortgage pass-through certificates. So that way it becomes a slightly more complex structure as compared to a pass-through variety. But again, a structure which is popular amongst market participants. Now, a few common ways to structure a CMO. So we'll study each of these four in detail. One is a sequential pay structure. Then is a PAC, or what we call as a planned amortization class. Then there are interest only and principal only securities. So these are very, very similar to what we call as the treasury strips. So we have USD treasuries, and on USD treasuries we have something like a treasury strips feature. So the idea is similar even in a strips which we create from US traded treasury securities. Uh, these give uh, these give the investors an option to take certain positions in those securities. That is, you can have interest only and principal only strips which get created, and that's like a avenue which investors can explore. So something similar happens here as well. We take a security and we strip that security into interest and principal only type of securities, and that is something which is offered to market participants. So more about IO and PO securities will be covered. So starting with the sequential pay structure. Now, to understand this, imagine that there are three tranches which have been created. So we can imagine three tranches are like three slices which we have created from the securities pool. Now, in a sequential pay structure, the interest payment will be received by all the tranches. So here we have taken three tranches. So all the three are going to receive periodic interest payments. However, the way in which the principal repayments happen, that is different. Now, principal payment is received by the first tranche. Only after the first tranche is completely paid off will the interest payment be paid for the second tranche. Similarly, only when the second tranche is fully paid off, then the principal payment should be directed towards the third tranche. So this is how the principal repayments are going to happen. Now, at times, there can be a separate zero coupon tranche which is created. Now, the idea of a zero coupon tranche is it doesn't receive any coupon payment. So uh, that way, the idea is very similar to a zero coupon bond. It doesn't receive any interest, but it will just receive a principal payment once the other tranches requirements on principal repayments have been met. Now, to understand this through a simple structure here. Now, let's take three tranches A, B, and C, and imagine that these have been as per the level of seniority. That is, tranche A is the most senior tranche. Then comes tranche B and tranche C, and then we have a zero coupon tranche Z. We have taken principal amounts. So we have just taken a hypothetical amounts of $300, $200, 150. You can imagine it, these can be in millions as well. But for discussion, that denomination won't really matter much. Now, to understand the cash flow structure, now if we focus on tranche A, then the tranche A will receive the principal and interest until it is fully redeemed. Now, until the full principal of 300 is redeemed for tranche A, tranche B and C will receive only interest payments. So this is exactly in line with these 2 points which you have mentioned about interest and principal. So the principal of tranche A will be retired, then the principal repayments are directed to tranche B. Now, focusing on the cash flows for tranche B, the notional principal is $200. Now, tranche B will continue to receive interest payments, so that will happen. Now, it will receive interest payments, and the principal payments will happen only after the tranche A requirements have been met. That is, once the entire $300 principal on tranche A is met, only then will the principal payments on tranche B begin. For tranche C, it will receive interest payments until tranche A and B are fully redeemed. That is, once 300 plus $200 of notional are redeemed for tranche A and B respectively, only then will the principal payments be directed towards tranche C. Otherwise, interest payments anyways will continue. Now for tranche Z, which we call as a zero coupon tranche. Now this tranche, as the name goes, is not going to receive any interest. It will only receive the final principal payment once A, B, and C have been redeemed in entirety. So this is what we call as a sequential pay structure. Why the name is sequential pay? Because the way in which the payment happens is following a certain specific sequence. So specifically, if we focus on the principal payment, we can relate that with the nomenclature of sequential pay. That is, the senior most tranche receives the first principal repayment in entirety, then the following tranches. Then we have a pack tranche or a planned amortization class. Now, in this structure, there are several tranches plus what we call as a companion tranche. Now, a companion tranche is there for handling any kind of prepayment risk which this entire structure is exposed to. Because we know that in the MBS securitized market, there is a considerable amount of prepayment risk which investors are exposed to. Now, for addressing the issue on prepayments, this companion tranche has been created. So in this structure, the principal redemption schedule is fixed. Now, fixed prepayment schedule is followed in accordance with the PSA standard. We have already discussed something on PSA standards some time back. Now, the actual prepayments which happen, they can definitely vary, right? Because finally, we are just trying to model the prepayment. So whenever we are doing calculations like PSAs or trying to do an evaluation or estimation as to what will be the prepayments, it's an estimation. But in reality, depending on the market scenario and the market conditions, prepayments can be high or low. So when you say that there is uncertainty on prepayments, then there are fluctuations, and we need some way to address these fluctuations. Now, the fluctuations in the prepayments are absorbed by the companion tranche. So companion tranche is there to absorb any kind of prepayment risk which the entire structure is exposed to. And this is what you call as a planned amortization class structure. Next is IO and PO strips, which is interest only and principal only. Now, to understand them, we have created a small table giving the points of differences so that understanding this becomes very easy and straightforward. So starting with the IO structure or interest only. Now, interest only strips are going to receive interest payments. Now, as the name goes, they are not going to receive any kind of principal, but just the interest payments. Now, if we look at two interest rate scenarios, that is a rising interest rate scenario and a falling interest rate scenario, we'll see how exactly it impacts the investors who are holding an IO strip. Now, if interest rates fall, this implies that the amount of prepayments which are made by borrowers, they are going to increase. Now, whenever the prepayments increase, that implies that the principal outstanding is going to drop at a faster rate. Now, because the principal is dropping at a faster rate, naturally that will imply that the amount of cash flow which is received as a part of interest payments, that will come down. In other words, the interest cash flows are going to come down for IO strip holders. Whereas if it's a rising interest rate environment, then in a rising rate scenario, naturally the amount of prepayments are going to decrease. So as the prepayments decrease, the principal outstanding remains intact more or less. It's not exposed to too much of prepayments. So it doesn't drop at a very faster rate. And as a result, the amount of interest cash flows which get generated are more. That is, the interest payments which will be received by IO holders, that will be higher. So these are the two scenarios, a rising or a falling interest rate respectively. Next, let's try to contrast this with what happens for the PO only strip or the principal only portion. Now, as the name goes, the principal only strip will receive only principal payments. It will not receive any kind of interest payments. Again, we are going to analyze the two scenarios which we did earlier in a falling interest rate environment and in a rising interest rate environment. What exactly happens to the PO note holders? So in a falling rate scenario, we know that the amount of prepayments are always higher. As a result, the principal amount which gets paid out, it's higher and at a faster rate. So that way, those who are holding the PO securities in a rising interest rate environment, they will observe that or they will witness a higher amount of cash flow being paid out to them. Whereas in a rising rate environment, whenever the amount of prepayments decrease, then in this case, the principal amount which gets paid out will drop or will reduce. As a result, the cash flows which will be received by the principal only holders is going to come down in a rising rate scenario. Now, this is how we can contrast an interest only and a principal only strip.